Selamat malam, warga ilmiah. Berlanjut lagi ke episode dari playlist Membaca Ilmiah. Masih tetap dengan buku The Entangled Brain How what is it? The Entangled Brain How Perception, Cognition, and Emotion are woven together. Masih tetap pada materi pada pembahasan buku ini. Sekarang kita beranjak menuju ke bagian kedua, perception, learning a bit of anatomy. Di chapter sebelumnya, kita benar-benar fokus pada tidak semudah, tidak sesederhana itu dalam merepresentasikan bagaimana otak itu bekerja, bagaimana mekanisme dari otak dalam menginterpretasikan behavior yang ada dalam kehidupan kita, tapi sangat kompleks dan hingga sekarang masih dalam perjalanan menuju komprehensi yang lebih tinggi dengan berbagai macam penelitian serta penemuan. Oke, kita lanjut ke chapter yang kedua, learning a bit of anatomy. Okay, without anatomy, we can't learn much about the brain. Knowing where things are and understanding what is connected to what are starting points to differing function. So we must familiarize ourselves with the basics of neuroanatomy. Whereas pure memorization plays an important role, understanding some general principles is also essential. There is no way around it. Anatomy may be dry, but we need it to be able to navigate around the brain. This chapter provides a very brief overview of neuroanatomy that should be helpful to readers unfamiliar with the basics. Whereas others may be considered skimming the material, anatomy and function are never far from each other, and some of the discussion below will deal with conceptual issues of understanding the relationship between structure, brain tissue, and function. The section on biologist axiom, a brief detour into software and thinking about people's nutrition should be of interest to those more familiar with anatomy. Oke, kita lihat ya beberapa section dalam chapter ini. Pertama ada the outer blanket of the cerebrum, cortex, biologist axiom, a brief detour into software, the great cell masses, cortex, the specialized cell of the nervous system, ini adalah neurons, the massive highway system, thinking about network, not region. Oke, itu adalah beberapa section yang ada dalam buku ini, dalam chapter ini. Oke, utamanya dalam chapter ini adalah anatomi adalah di kalimat yang ini. Jadi anatomy and function are never far from each other. Some modification below will be basis of understanding the relationship between structure, or brain tissue, and function as a behavior. Ini yang ide utama dari chapter itu. When we think of the human brain, the first thing that comes to mind is the cortex, the outer zone of the cerebrum with bumps and grooves. Figure 2.1a seperti yang ada di gambar ini salah satu ilustrasi dari cerebral cortex. Kemudian when the brain is sliced and appropriately stained to mark the presence of neurons, we see that the cortex is a thin enclosure of densely packed cell. Figure 2.1. Oke, jadi cortex itu adalah outermost, jadi ada di bagian sini. Jadi warna yang ada di bagian hitam, yang bagian gray matter itu adalah bagian cortex, sedangkan white matter itu bukan, gitu. Terus setelah itu the cortex bark, dalam bahasa Inggris itu kan bark ya, jadi kulit dari pohon, to bark in Latin, like the exterior covering the trunk and branches of a tree and follows the brain like a ring. In humans and some other animals, the cortex is not smooth but highly convoluted. It's spread like a dove. It will be the size of a large pizza, so the invaginations help pack a larger brain inside the skull. Nih, kalau apa namanya, human dan mammal itu mostly itu tidak small permukaannya. Jadi permukaannya tidak apa ya, berbuku-buku. Jadi kayak apa namanya, ada lekukan banyak sekali gitu. Microscopically, the cortex has fine layer structure like milk to dessert containing three layers of pastry, alternating with two layers of pastry cream of varying similar complexity. Although at first glance the cortex looks the same everywhere, in some sectors it might have a few as a tree, and in other it as many as six discernible cell layers. In some parts the layers are discernible too, so even more packing can be identified. And the thickness of the cortex is not the same everywhere, but varies between 2 and 3 millimeters. But despite important differences in layering and other properties, the cortex is relatively the same whether you are at the front or back or top or bottom of the brain. Ini apa namanya, karakter bentuknya. The brain contains two key types of tissue. Green matter contains neurons, which are thought to be the key processing elements of the nervous system, as well as several other cell types that support and protect the cellular environment, and likely contribute to computation in ways as yet poorly understood. Oke, ini apa namanya? Green matter contains neuron. I'll put on this. And then white matter contain nerve fibers, which are the cell extensions called axons of neurons bundled together and that serve as communication highways both within and between brain regions. Many of these nerve fibers are enveloped by myelin, a substance that acts as electrical insulator and speeds signal conduction along axons, and if the white matter is colored. Further below, we'll discuss neurons and axons as well as axons function, the dendrites. A slice through the brain also reveals concentration of cells that lie deeper within it and constitute aptly named subcortex, whereas the cortex is essentially a thin sheet of neurons, more precisely, multiple sheets stacked together at the outer edge. A subcortex is wholly different to be uninitiated. A two-dimensional slice gives a little clue as to the underlying. Oke, ini bagian subcortical brain region, ada thalamus, ada hypothalamus, amygdala, dan VAG is very adequate grade. Kurang terlalu mengetahui bagian ini, jarang sekali dibahas dalam beberapa buku. Nanti mungkin kita bisa ulik lebih lanjut tentang very adequate grade. Oke, where was us? Okay, as underlying the shape of subcortical regions as the realm of full of oddly shaped mass as of tissue. Ini gambarnya ada seperti ini. The clouded putamen, thalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, and brainstem. Here is where neuroanatomists imaginations have run wild with the challenge of naming structures, possibly creating a modern day nightmare for medical students prior to exams. Knowledge of Greek and Latin comes in handy because we find structures with names like hippocampus for its seahorse shape, amygdala for its almond shape, howdah for looking like a tail, and even substantia nigra when gravity fails, name it the thing, substance for its color when chemically extinct. Despite the complexity revealed by slicing brain tissue, the brain's organization can be better appreciated if we consider how it forms embryologically. The entirety of organ originates from structural cell called neural tube, which is literally shaped like cylinder. At some point during embryonic development, this tube, which fairly regular occurs, creates at three places and pulses so four compartments can be discerned. These brain are the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, and spinal cord. The last three contains no cortex. The first contains both of cortex and several subcortical structures, which we'll learn about later. If it seems confusing to have both cortex and subcortex in the forebrain, remember that this is not arbitrary. Embryologically, they both originate from the segment of the neural tube that differentiates into the forebrain. As the embryo changes in shape, names are needed to keep track of its multiple parts. As these shapes evolve into mature state, that forebrain gives rise to both cortex externally and multiple subcortical inner structures. Oke, kalau kita lihat dari sudut pandang embriologi, embryonic development. Oke, ini kita kasih dulu. Ya, awalnya ini namanya adalah neural tube. The entirety of organ central nervous system itu originally neural tube. Dari neural tube ini kemudian bergerak menjadi 4 bagian. Ya, ada 4 compartments division. Forebrain, middle brain, and hindbrain also split up. Jadi ada 4 bagian, jadi differentiate into 4 kind. Oke, jadi seperti ini. Makanya dalam bahasa Inggris, forebrain itu menunjukkan otak depan. Padahal otak yang ini ada di atas. Jadi menggunakan forebrain kalau dalam bentuk embriologi hampir di semua hewan mamalia malah pembentukan otak secara embriologi ini berada di depan. The outer blanket of the cerebrum or cortex, although the cortex are fairly regular structure throughout, it is large enough that we need to subdivide it to be able to orient ourselves. See figure 2.1, gambar yang ada di atas tadi, yang sebelumnya di sini. Buat atasnya begitu. Ini dia. Ada frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, dan occipital lobe. Frontal lobe itu ada bagian depan, kemudian parietal lobe ada di bagian atas, agak belakang dikit, kemudian occipital lobe belakang dan bawah, kemudian temporal lobe ada di samping kanan dan samping kiri yang agak di bawah, begitu. Jadi, its main parts are named after skull bones, to which they are adjacent. Occipital in the back of the skull, temporal near the temples on the side of the skull, parietal at the side and top toward the back of the skull, and frontal on the front part of the skull. The other parts of the cortex aren't visible from the outside, need to be seen from the inside to reveal themselves, like the ingin, see figure 6.1, which Wow, coba proses point one ini ada di bagian 6 sini kah? Figure 6.1. Wow, jauh banget ngambil gambar. Kita balik sini. Kemudian we slice along the middle part of each hemisphere, and the brain is made up of two halves, or hemispheres, and the insula figure 6.6, which is hidden to it, of the front of parietal cortices. The name insula from island, and indeed, this part of the cortex is somewhat like an island of the parietal, temporal, and frontal cortices. Finally, the hippocampus is a cortical structure with simple lamination, located in the medial wall of the hemisphere, where they come closest to touching. Although we often associate the cortex with the human brain, this type of tissue is present in mammal. Kita cek dulu mengenai bagian cingulate, insula, serta cingulate, insula, dan bagian-bagian lainnya. Ya, akan kita bahas di image brain. Hmm, jadi ada insula, ada cingulate. Kalau itu gambar, jadi sebelah mana ya, yang lebih jelas ya, di bagian dalam. Hmm, oke, mungkin bisa dilihat di ya, kalau ya, oke. Dari segi oh, oke, ini adalah bagian sulit ya, ada di bagian dalam. Jadi kalau kita apa namanya, buka lapisan pertama di sana, bagian yang ada di dalam di bagian temporal sama parietal, buka sedikit di situ nanti akan ada cingulate atau limbic system ya. Ini cingulate sulcus ada di bagian sini, ini lebih jelas. Kemudian insula bagiannya ada di bagian agak sulit menunjukkan. Oke, ya, ini di insula ada di dalam, jadi agak sulit untuk dilihat jelas gitu. Oke, Jadi informasi mengenai apa namanya bagian dari os. Oke, ada bagian-bagian dari otak ya, jadi anatominya sedikit. Obviously, with human brain, this type of tissue is present in all animals. Firstly, it is observed in a parts of the forebrain as some reptiles. Although it's fairly small, and as discussed in Chapter 9, fishes, amphibians, and birds have brain parts that are related to those containing the cortex in mammals. In very basic sense, what makes the cortex a cortex is that it contains a laminated pattern. The six-layer cortex, found only in mammals, appears to be related to the three-layer of cortex found in reptiles. Indeed, it has been suggested that common elements in three and six-layer cortex are much like common set of bones of the basic vertebrate skeleton. Just as the hand has been adapted for limbs digit by evolutionary pressure, so have the circuit elements of the basic cortical microcircuit adapted during cortical evolution. Such commonalities in traits are called homologies, which is to say they stem from common evolutionary ancestor. Ya, ini ada commonalities between all of our ancestors. Jadi berdasarkan evolusi, kita memiliki bentuk yang sama sehingga beberapa hal yang umum general yang kesamaan dengan hewan itu uh, terjadi begitu, namanya adalah homologies. Note, however, that reptiles and mammals diverged more than 300 million years ago. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We will discuss the evolution of the vertebrate brain in more detail in Chapter 9. Despite the heterogeneity of layering across the human cortex, this tissue type is relatively uniform. If scientists are often classified as lumpers of splitters, it is probably safe to say that the most neuroanatomies will fall squarely in the latter camp. In fact, it is not surprising that neuroanatomists have been trying to break up the cortex into smaller parts from the very beginning of neuroscience as modern discipline. Ya, yang seperti as discussed in chapter 1, ini yang menemukan 80 bagian dari cerebral cortex kemarin. Bahasanya merujuk ke sana. Oke, kita lanjut ke section selanjutnya, biology stuff. In 1899, upon arriving in Berlin, Cecilia and Scaffold established the Neurobiological Laboratory, at first a private institution for the anatomical study of human brain. Cecil Ford was one of only two women in the entire Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research, which included the Neurobiological Laboratory. Nicosia was capitalized 1701 until around the end of World War One. Women were not granted access to regular university education, let alone the possibility to have a scientific career. Cecile obtained her doctoral degree while she was still in France and studied myelination in the cerebral hemispheres. The Fogg collaborated scientifically from 1899 to 1959, and an effort that at first depended solely on the earnings from their private medical practice and on the support from the Krupp family, a 400-year-old German. The years after the neurobiological laboratory was found, Corbinian Broadman joined the group and was encouraged to undertake a systematic study of the cells of cerebral cortex using sections trained with a new cell marking method. Cecil and Oscar Ford and Roman work is fairly in their lab were part of the first wave of anatomists trying to establish a map of cerebral cortex. Neurons are diverse, and several cell classes can be determined based on both shape and size. Researchers use their property as well as spatial differences in distribution and density to define the boundaries between potential sectors. In this manner, Broadman subdivided the cortex approximately to 50 regions per hemisphere. The folk, in contrast, thought that there may be over 200 of them, each with its own distinguishing cytoarchetypal pattern that cell-related organization. Rodman's map is the one that cut on and stuck, and today students and researchers analyze the refer to cortical parts by invoking this map. Although relatively little was known about the function of cortical regions at the time, Rodman believed that his partition is a private organ of the mind. He was convinced that each cortical served a particular function. Indeed, when he joined the Fox laboratory, they had encouraged him to try to understand the organization of the cortex in light of their main thesis. Different cytoarchitectonically defined areas are responsible for specific physiological responses and function. Oke, ini sedikit history mengenai awal mula mapping dari cerebral cortex. There is a deep logic that to what Fogg and Brutman were following. In fact, it is an idea that comes close to being an axiom in biology. Function is tied to structure such that, in the case at hand, part of the cortex that are structurally different contain different cell types, cell arrangement, and cell density and so on, carry out different functions in this manner. They believe they could infer the understanding of how function is implemented from a detailed characterization of the underlying microanatomy. In effect, they were in search of the functional units of the cortex, unlike other organs of the body, which have more clear-cut boundaries. The cortex's potential subdivisions are not readily apparent at macroscopic level. Ini salah satu highlight ya. Jadi cerebral cortex itu kesulitannya dalam divide itu tidak terlalu terlihat dalam macroscopic pattern. One of the central goals of many neurotopists in the first half of the 20th century was to unravel such organ. An objective that persists to this day. Corollary of this research program was that individual brain regions, say Provenance Area 17 in the back of the brain, implemented special mechanism in this case related to processing visual sensory stimuli. Ini kan pernyataan ini didasarkan dari apa namanya kemarin pendekatan dari lesion dalam penelitian. Therefore, it was vital to understand the operation of individual parts as the area was the rightful mechanistic unit to understand how the brain works. Although the brain map produced by the fog with close to 200 areas was not widely adopted by scientific community, their approach clearly superior to that most of their contemporaries, Broadman included. Because of the explicitly compared cellular and functional data, they perform electrophysiological studies in patients and monkeys. They also studied cats and compared, and they independently achieved architectonic and functional results in both species to clarify the operation of structurally defined areas. Of course, electrophysiological methods of the time were rather crude and amounted to using low-intensity electrical stimulation to observe what behaviors were produced. Whereas the technical verbal separately limited what could be learned. So they produced many pioneering observations. Theirs was an extremely advanced conceptual framework that continues to inspire neuroscience today. Jadi ada yang lebih superior yang punya Ford dibandingkan di Broadman ya, karena they explicitly compare cellular and functional data. I would like to see how difference 200 bagian banyak banget. Oh ini Mio dari Mio dia membaginya menjadi banyak. Oke, let's go to the next chapter. A brief detour into software. Let's consider biology's axiom different structures implies different function. In the context of concepts like biology, the development of the computer in the 1940s and then the 1950s led to important new insights, including those of software and hardware. Software stands for a set of basic instructions or commands that, if executed by some algorithm, is computed. So factorizing a non-prime number like 2010, which can be written as 2 multiplied by 3 multiplied by 5 multiplied by 67. A study paper published in 1936, Alan Turing defines an imaginary machine that is capable of calculating anything that can be algorithmically computed. This was, of course, before any hardware computer was ever constructed. The first computers were built in the 1940s, although most of us would not recognize them as such in a museum, including the Colossus, which was created to help British code breakers during include read encrypted German messages during World War II. The ideas by Turing, as well as those by the mathematician Alan Turing, among the all-time most significant realizations, and John von Neumann, famous for designing the basic logic architecture of modern computers, among many others, had a profound effect on philosophers and scientific trying to understand the notion of computation in both natural systems, including the nervous system, and artificial ones. An influential framework emerged in the new field called philosophy of mind was that of functionalism, which asserts that mental states are identified by their functional role, not by how they are physically implemented. Thus, a mind can be stimulated by various physical systems, possibly even computers, as long as they carry out appropriate computation. According to functionalism, the human brain is one possibly many physical devices capable of implementing mental function accurately. Ini jadi ada pendekatan komputasi yang apakah otak juga memiliki pendekatan yang sama. Di sini akhirnya muncul filosofi apa namanya adalah functionalism yang menyisipkan mental state berdasarkan fungsi perannya, tidak hanya secara fisik saja. Ini sudah mulai masuk ke dalam abstraksi. Jadi apa ya, main itu secara kalimat sulit sekali untuk diukur, kurang apa ya, empirik. Oke, lanjutkan lagi. If some of these feels like angel of the philosophy to you, Well, it is until it isn't. To this day, neuroscience faces this very question. To what extent do differential structure properties, say neurons of different shapes, affect the function carried out? Under what circumstances do different organizations of structure lead to similar computation and so on? Example, the avian brain is organized in some ways that are rather different from that of mammals. Although a cortex is not one in birds, the dorsal forebrain of the two groups of vertebrates appears to follow similar computational principle that intend different. Jadi apa namanya? Ada salah satu contoh ketika burung itu kan tidak memiliki forebrain karena burung itu kan dia secara evolusi dia pecah dari reptil, tidak masuk ke dalam kategori mammalia begitu. Sehingga memiliki evolusi yang tidak sama dengan mammals. Namun secara konsep, secara teoritik, dua otak yang berbeda mammals dengan burung itu hampir memiliki fungsi yang sama. Before proceeding, let's define a few terms of orientation that allows us to navigate up, down, front, and back in the brain. Convenient terms for up or down are superior or and inferior, but dorsal and ventral are used correspondingly also. Okay. Dorsal itu punggung, ventral itu perut. The back of the brain is arbitrarily defined as posterior, so the front is anterior. Sometimes systems must need to be used to be carefully because whereas the human brain is vertically oriented with respect to the main body axis, in other species, the body axis is horizontal in our fish, but we won't worry about that too much in the book. Oke, jadi ini hanya menjelaskan tentang apa namanya main. Jadi di sini software itu dikatakan main, itu software. Jadi apa sih softwarenya, apa hardwarenya? Kalau software berarti pendekatan adalah fungsi. Kalau hardware pendekatan fisikal, kalau hardwarenya mungkin otak, kalau software mungkin main atau pikiran. Itu. Jadi memang hal tersebut sulit kembali untuk didefinisikan. Okay, the great cell masses, subcortex. Describing subcortical structures would fill an entire book. That's massive understatement. That's not only because there are already quite a few books written about them, but because each structure is pretty complex and heterogeneous. For example, the amygdala, a region that is popular enough that most readers will have encountered it a few times in the popular media, extends to no more than 10 millimeters along its longest axis and 6 millimeters in the orthogonal one. Its shape at least like a almond. Yet, as mentioned in chapter 1, it has more than a dozen subparts called subnuclei that are structurally different, even varied neuronal types and patterns of input-output connection, and possibly even more, depending on how it is partitioned. As we know, the forebrain contains both cortex and subcortex. The subcortical part is located on the base toward the middle. Jadi, tadi bagian semua, semua di bagian dalam, amigdala, batang otak, ya, jadi semuanya ada di bagian dalam yang cerebral cortex. Medial lebih tepat. Many prominent subcortical structures are found there, including the thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and striatum. For the latter, see figure 5.9. At times, the hippocampus is listed as subcortical structure, but technically it isn't part of subcortex, even though it is listed here because of its close association with the subcortical areas and simple laminal skull structure. Among the most important subcortical regions of the forebrain is the thalamus, which lies in the inner chamber of the brain from the big thalamus chamber. The thalamus is a key physician children. The usual pattern by way of comparing the human brain with the ground plan of Greek house. With the bridal chamber at its heart, whereas the name of Thomas is still used, Carrara's program referring to what called the third vertical today. For vision, auditions, motor sensation, and taste, individual public experience signal from the sensory periphery pass through the thalamus before reaching the respective cortical areas. Ini ada jalur penghubung. Thalamus itu adalah jalur penghubung antara sensori periphery menuju ke for instance, fibers leaving the retina of the eye are directed to the part of thalamus that is connected to the visual cortex in the back of the brain in the occipital area. The part receiving thalamic correction is called primary visual cortex or area free one or visual area one. Likewise, fibers leaving the inner ear after some stops along the way, reach a part of the thalamus that is connected with the auditory cortex in the temporal cortex. Analogously, this part of the brain is called primary auditory cortex or area A1 for auditory area 1. But the thalamus is much more than a simple relay station for a sensory information reaching the cortex and is divided into more than certain subcategories with complex connectivity pattern with both the cortex and very rich array of subcortical regions. Indeed, in the latter chapter, we will discuss how the thalamus is critically involved in the cortical subcortical loops that play essential computational roles. Adjacent to the thalamus, we find the striatum, so name given by scripted perforate appearance. Oke, ini sedikit perlu di-highlight. Microscopically, it contains a few subdivisions called the caudet and putamen. A remarkable property of the striatum is that the exception of the primary visual cortex, all of the cortex projects to it from the sensory region to the simple response to the frontal area. Participate in abstract processes. Medium project is subtle among others that have direct impact on motor action. In that, historically, the striatum manages and structure from inverted basal ganglia have been understood as the motor system. As study chapter 1 as literally as 1664, Thomas will describe the striatum, noting the generation of this structure in patients who suffer from severe paralysis, an observation that led him to link with it with body movement. He believed that should maintain the channel of the flow spirits contrary to mass. Throughout the book, we will discuss how the striatum in particular and the Pennsylvania more generally are involved much more than motor function. Oke, seperti yang sebelumnya, ternyata ini jauh lebih kompleks daripada in human, below for the forebrain, the central nervous system extends downward into midbrain, hindbrain, and spinal cord. The brain system frequently refers to the large collection of structures in the midbrain and hindbrain, although the usage is not always consistent across all thought. As the name suggests, the overall arrangement resembles them on top of each other. The rest of the brain stands, given that person is relatively large. It is typically subdivided into three sectors. The midbrain itself, in addition to the pons and medulla in the midbrain, these three sectors are quite complex and far from homogeneous, and they contain dozens of areas, each of which participates on multiple functions. The brainstem is home of many circuit essential for the basic processes, such as breathing and constraint heart rate in short reaches and applies. In fact, images of alpha brainstem cause coma, so-called persistent vegetative state of partial arousal but not true awareness, in which patients can open their eyelids occasionally and exhibit sleep-wake cycles but completely lack cognitive function. Oke, jadi kebanyakan bagian yang ada di brainstem itu penting sekali untuk regulating stroke affecting the brainstem can also lock in syndrome, in which the patient is completely paralyzed but remain conscious. A devastating condition Hanley described the first-person perspective in the book The Diving Bell and Fly. The specialized cells of the nervous system or neurons. The human body has over 200 cell types that makes up our tissues, and abdominal human brain has approximately 86 billion neurons, 60 billion of which are in the cerebral cortex. The cell type that is believed to be responsible for most of its unique functions. The current estimate as a dollar revision from over 100 billion features appears to have been a guesstimate. The number 86 may be revised to given that it is based on very small sample of brains on male death. Neurons are diverse group of cells, including cells specialized to capture and share information, such as light sensing cells in the eyes, and motor neurons that innervate the particle appendages of speed and little muscular movement. A typical neuron has two main distinguishable parts: a region that contains the cell nucleus and a set of thin tube radiations that extend outwardly. The central part is called the cell body or soma. Radiating tubes are two types: axon and dendrite. The cell body usually gives rise to a single axon, which can extend over great distances. Some of the organelles can exist in the matter, such as the one from the lower back to the big toe, the part of the nervous system, also cranium, skull, peripheral nervous system. Thus, neuron extend long distance, as it was suspected early that they acted as wires that carry out the signal. Dendrites, on the other hand, are quite short and likely longer than 2 millimeters, because dendrite comes in contact with many axons. They were suggested to act as neuronal antennae and contribute to collecting incoming signals. One of the main ways that neurons communicate with one another is through action potentials. Okay. An action potential highly triggered if the electrical voltage crosses the threshold value, at which point is generated in all or non-patient. The electrical signal generated at the base of action result on the entire extent of constant intensity as it propagates. In this manner, the nerve impulse function as a binary on-off signal, but frequency and pattern action potential provide key information that is communicated between neurons. As a potential means the brain suddenly cuts into the extracellular space and measuring electrical voltage functional MRI, a technique we'll also discuss, but does not Misalnya Senior means that oxygen consumption at a small patch of tissue, but because neuronal activity is costly metabolically and consumption, functional MI is a process for neural activity, whereas the technique is very useful. Studying brain function, it is important to remember that it provides an indirect measure of the electrical signals that neuroscientists are most interested in. Others informal possibility in relationship mode of transmission through chemical synapses. Synapses are site of close contact between neurons, often between a cell's axon and undercell dendrite. When nerve impulse reach the end of the axon, they cause the release of specific chemicals at synaptic level called neurotransmitter. Ini neurotransmitter apa ya, chemical yang ketika dia bergerak akan menghasilkan some potential. The traversal wisdom from the presynaptic cells atau postsynaptic cell by altering the lateral cell membrane permeability properties, producing situation of inhibition of fall of the postsynaptic cell due to the inflow or outflow of ions. When the postsynaptic cell is sufficiently excited, it will generate an action potential that will be propagating and electrical signal that influence other neuron transferring the this cascade of firing reverberating across the brain is at the core of all mental activity, but remember that communication is not only electrical, like a set of electrical cables passing through signals along, it's electrochemical and arranged in a way that multiple signals can converge and can be integrated to lead to further action potentials. What prevents the brain from going into chronic firing, in effect creating an uncontrollable electrical storm. Indeed, if unchecked, excitation can be lead to seizures from relatively mild to extreme ones. So-called clonic seizure from grand seizure can be most frightening to observe. Typically, the person suffering from such a seizure initially stiffens and loses consciousness, thus falling to the ground. During the second phase, the muscle may begin to spasm and jack. The terrifying experience must usually last only a few minutes, although it can certainly seem like forever if one is helplessly watching it. As perhaps was not entirely surprising, the author literature that in Europe and Middle Ages epilepsy was confused with a witchcraft, especially when accompanied tremors, convulsions, and or loss of consciousness. But what prevents undamped excitation neurons influence each other not only in excitatory fashion, but also through inhibition. The latter case, when a neuron fires, make neuron connected and less likely to generate an action potential. Neurotransmitters are very diverse, and 100 different molecules have been cataloged, but approximately 10 of them do most of heavy lifting. They go by names such as dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, histamine, and so on. Some which are even household names for antidepressant like Prozac and the variants plus potassium act as serotonin transmission. This medication effect as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor to increase the effect of serotonin to postsynaptic cells, motion alcohol and drugs, the glorification of drugs like cannabis that has the effect neurotransmission, thereby leading to altered states of consciousness that modify perception and feeling. If you thought chemistry was boring, it is quite humbling that we don't really know about SSRI's work. The mechanism of action are not well understood. Like many medical treatment, they were discovered by accident and physicians prescribed them for the patient as 20 based on clinical experience. Love and David Anderson go as far as to say that trying to cure this depressed patient without understanding how the brain generates emotions that would be like trying to manipulate in the 15th century without understanding that bacteria and virus cause infectious disease. As regards what the sense is observation is, but not mechanism, as we know it. Di bagian ini tidak terlalu banyak yang bisa dikasih highlight. Jadi sistemnya seperti itu. Ketika melebihi threshold, maka action potensial akan. Okay, the massive highway system. Massive highway system. Gray matter is so important that the other part, white matter, is short. Gray matter is where all circular action takes place. White matter is just a bunch of cattle or so-called. Much of communication in the brain occurs locally, for example, the specific cortex or between two adjacent within the hippocampus. Case accents are relatively short, however, another type. Cognitive and the white matter tracks, namely bundles of accents packed together that form a major system that essential for signal transmission across the brain. Because their brain slice, just like a feature 2.1, and mentally remove all the outer layer of butters of clouds and stay from cell bodies, that is what the areas is pricing at first to consider how much remains. All of that might matter. Must have identified around 20 large tracks that interlink different blocks. Particular tracks differ a little from person to person, slightly thinner, thicker, or anchored like indifferently, but they are found in all typical brains. Ini tentang white matter ya sebagai uh, di jalan highways. Thinking about network, white matter is obvious interest of anatomists and neurologists when this with compromise, perhaps the soft tumor removal, very difficult are observed, but consideration of white matter's implication that the conceptual in nature and form one of the central questions occupied by the scientists. Function blended in the mental stance in neurons has tended to view function as the product of particular brain areas, somewhat like a dedicated shifted specialized computation. As we saw, his idea was very much in line with Promotion Preparation Program, and indeed was part of scientific CPS at the turn of the 20th century. This is the fiber tax was known since 16th century. In the human corpus fabricans, the specialist provided comprehensive of the corpus callosum and recognized that two links half of the brain. Yet anatomists like Roman was thought to produce brain map paid little attention to white matter of the brain, but Romans wasn't the only field. During the last decades of the 19th century, the same time that many researchers were busy studying the effect of lesion to specific part of the brain, a different school of thought was emerging. The associationist argued that if one observed behavioral change caused a lesion in brain area, the deficit could be due to impairment in region distant from the damaged site. Although magical and spiritual influences were very much involved during the experiences of gathering to some spiritual scenes for at the time. Nothing of the sort has been proposed here. Instead, do not utilize goods mechanism to pay for such action at distance effect. There is an explanation. This is from Greek and meaning mirrors throughout throughout mean that a given region was affected because it was connected with a damaged area, which represents a disruption of function of the former. The disturbances will be relatively mild but could be consequential. On the other hand, this connection refers to a situation which is two intact area particular completely connected because of insult to the major track linking them. Although the two areas remain unperturbed in contrast to the case of diathesis, they still may exhibit a disturbance of function leading to considerable behavioral alteration. Why? Because their function depend on their talking each other. Jadi fungsi itu berdasarkan hubungan antar neuron, motor, dan sebagainya. Primus memory is this connection of so-called Wernicke area in the parietal cortex and Broca's area in the frontal cortex. Because of the damage to the tract that interlink the region that plays important roles in speech production and language comprehension. What the associationists were hinting at can be viewed as the early incarnation of network theories when the initial brain function are not carried by single isolated regions, but by a coalition of regions that may be involved in the neural circuit that are not local. For instance, evolving parts of parietal and frontal cortex in the case of speech and language. This is the last section, the aforementioned aforementioned section is about the idea if the damage from one side could be affect the other side, nanti bisa mempengaruhi bagian lainnya melalui white matter ini. Karena white matter itu adalah sarana penghubung antar suborgan. Coda learning about neurotomy can be rather dual. That is part-wise commoditized and about cortical and subcortical organization by pairing regions with their main function or small set of function. Say, the hippocampus is important for memory, the prefrontal cortex is important for attention and rhythmics, and so on. We all avoid this approach here because of not possibly better detected approach, but because of the central thesis of the book. Brain areas don't compute specific function. They are not segregated organ in mind. Why? The brain is not modular system that can be understood region at a time. Instead, we need to unravel how collision cortical, subcortical brainstem regions work together for complex behavior. And as discussed in chapter 9, this is not just the case of human brain but across all vertebrates, even chimpanzees. Jadi di bagian ini, chapter yang kedua, mostly menjelaskan mengenai bagian-bagian secara anatomi. Namun penjelasannya sangat sederhana. Jadi kemungkinan besar tidak akan sulit untuk dipahami bagi orang awam. Gitu. Gitu. Jadi fokusnya untuk di apa namanya tulisan buku dari Luiz Pessoa itu memang ditujukan untuk mainstream readers yang ingin mengetahui, mengulik bagaimana neuroscience itu dipahami, utamanya bahwa mekanisme kerja otak itu tidak modular, tidak satu bagian penuh, not a whole things, ya hanya beberapa bagian yang saling membantu, ya adalah saling berkoneksi, berhubungan dengan hal lain, makanya dinamakan network. Jadi fokus untuk yang kedua, learning bit of anatomy tetap seperti yang sebelumnya, yakni mendukung bahwa kompleksitas otak itu sangat sulit untuk disederhanakan. Dan ada berbagai macam bagian yang benar-benar perlu diberikan notes dibandingkan bagian yang gitu. Jadi untuk video mengenai second chapter The Entangled Brain, ya. Second chapter The Entangled Brain. What is the definition? How perception, cognition, emotion are woven together. Jadi memang apa ya, anatomi itu sebenarnya tidak cukup baik untuk menjelaskan mekanisme, tapi setidaknya itu adalah langkah awal yang baik untuk mengetahui ini tempatnya apa gitu. Jadi bukan berarti itu representasi dari otak, dari bagian otak yang itu terhadap sebuah fungsi behavior yang terlihat. Oke, mungkin itu dulu ya. Kita akan bahas selanjutnya tentang the minimal brain, building simple defenses and seeking reward. Di ada two small hits on the road. Decision, shoring up defenses, seeking out rewards, neurotransmitter, a short detour, signal, ingin, extending the circuit. Ini untuk video selanjutnya. Kita akan lanjutkan di selanjutnya. Terima kasih sudah menonton. Semoga bermanfaat buat kalian, buat teman-teman semua. Dan bila ada, silahkan dukung menonton video. Bagi yang ingin bergabung dengan komunitas kami, knowledge.com, saya pastikan untuk di website kami, knowledge.com, silahkan daftar, login di sana, dan mungkin bisa ya, memilih. Di sana akan ada forum bersama, kemungkinan besar bila berjalan dengan baik akan saya dapat. Oke, itu dulu. Bye bye.